You know, if DC could go a couple of decades without a crisis, that'd be great.
Coming to Kickstarter this June, John Haynes at Death's Door, the man who rules the world, takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the standard and variant editions of John Haynes at Death's Door and lots of other great stretch goal rewards on Kickstarter this June. I would like to go a couple of decades without DC Comics having a crisis. Now, DC Comics is launching its latest crisis event, Dark Crisis, right now, and the Justice League were killed as the catalyst for this event. Now, I find these crisis events to be getting a little bit long in the tooth because we have had multiple crises ever since 1986, with the first Crisis of Infinite Earths, where the DC Universe was looking to try to fix its continuity issues as related to having Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, and other Earths where other characters like the Shazam characters and the Captain Carrot characters were all consolidated into one DC universe. Now, in the aftermath of the 1986 Crisis of Infinite Earths, we got one main Earth which featured all of the DC characters, and it managed to acknowledge all of the continuities of the past thanks to the craftsmanship of writers like Marv Wolfman and artists like the late George Perez. However, just as soon as DC managed to work and fix its continuity issues, there was a series of more continuity issues that they had with Hawkman and other characters that led to them having the 0 Hour event. And in the aftermath of the 0 Hour event, things looked like they were stable until we got into the 2000s and your Dan Didio decided that he had made such a mess with the DC Universe with events like your Graduation Day and Identity Crisis that we needed to have an Infinite Crisis, we needed to have a Final Crisis, and we needed to have a Flashpoint, a New 52, and then after that we had a Convergence, and then we had another I think event. But the whole thing is DC's constant focus on continuity has really done a lot of damage to DC's overall brand, because these days it's next to impossible to figure out what's going on in a DC comic these days, because we don't know what is canon and what is not. And that's a major problem when it comes down to trying to pick up a DC comic. You don't know where it starts, and you don't know what DC character is a canon character, because every couple of years we get the entire DC universe upheaved, and when it gets upheaved, we don't know where anything starts or where anything finishes. I mean, when I look at DC Comics these days, it's just so confusing. I mean, you've got the Dark Crisis going on with a dead Justice League, but everybody in their own comics is still going on like business as usual. That's really confusing for a new reader, and it's one of the things that drives readers away from comics. Now, when I look at DC Comics, there are two major problems with DC Comics. One is the excessive focus on continuity, because the excessive focus on continuity makes it where you don't know where anything begins or anything ends. And the other problem I see is this constant focus on the event model of storytelling. Now, the event model of storytelling started in the 1980s as an effort to try to prop up the sales of mid-tier and low-tier books that were basically struggling, and hopefully they were hoping that after you bought all the books in the event, you would start buying these titles regularly. Now, this worked for a while for Marvel and DC. Back in the 80s, these events would get people to go out here and pick up books that they wouldn't regularly buy. But here in 2022, this whole event approach has become outdated, it has become archaic, and many comic fans are tired of having to spend over $200 to go pick up an entire story. that basically ends up not meaning anything at the end of the day, because what will happen is a major event will come and undo the previous event. And that's one of the things that irritates me about the constant crises. We have one crisis that undoes all of the other crises, and then they start another crisis to undo the previous crisis, and it just becomes very, very confusing to sit there and read. Now, when I look at DC Comics, I would like to go a couple of decades without a crisis, because the whole thing is that crises are just confusing the reader, one, and two, it's not generating sales. In fact, it's alienating not only readers from DC Comics, but it is also alienating customers from picking up merchandise. Now, there's been a major problem with DC merchandise for the last decade and a half as related to this whole continuity problem that started in 2011, and that led to the decline of sales of DC Universe Classics figures. It led to the decline of DC Direct figures, and then DC Collectibles couldn't get any traction because there were so many different versions of so many different characters. I mean, there's like 6, 7, 8 different Batmans, 4, 6, 7 different Supermans, 8, 9 different Wonder Womans. It becomes just a problem for the customer, and that's why I believe DC Comics really needs to stop with the crises and move on to a different story model. Now, I myself at SJS Direct, I don't use an event story model, because for me, events are stories that really, they don't have any meaning at the end of the day. Yes, they get your attention by saying, oh, a major menace is coming and all the heroes have to come together, and they promise that nothing will ever be the same, but it becomes the same thing all the time. And I would rather use a more organic approach to storytelling, where I focus on milestones in a character's history, and those milestones are the thing that will get you to come back and pick up more stories. Like, for example, I did the story Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, which was an Isis series story, and in that story, that's where Isis meets John Haynes. So it was an event as related to Isis taking on one of her big arch enemies, but it was also something that was important because she meets John Haynes for the first time. So it's flowing in organically into the character's story and flows into the character's history. So you have a reason to go pick it up, because it's flowing into the character's stories, and you're not having to read some event where, oh, this may have happened and then it will be undone. No, this is done, this is canon, and this is all about going to stay in the canon, and you can feel confident about it staying in the canon. So that's something that I focus on heavily when I'm working on SJS Direct stories, like Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, or stories like Esteem Ascension, where Esteem loses her demon powers. It's something there that you know is going to be canon, something that you know is going to be there, and you know is something that's going to not change at all. And that's what customers want with their stories, with DC characters. They want to have that consistency. They want the storylines to still be what they knew that they were. They want the characters to remain the same, and they want everything to stay consistent. And that consistency is something that gives the reader an incentive to go out here and buy a DC comic, because they can trust that nothing is going to be radically changed by some event or some gimmick. They can trust that, okay, when I go to the comic shop, Superman is going to be Clark Kent. He's going to be working at the Daily Planet. Bruce Wayne is going to be a rich guy who is Batman. I can trust that everything that was there is going to be there. And when I pick up this book, I can pick up where I left off as related to this character remaining consistent to who they are. But when you have constant events like these constant crises, it makes it where you can't count on anything to be consistent. What it does is it just gives you a whole lot of upheaval, and this upheaval it's really distressing, because nothing is staying the same. And when you upheave everything for a customer who's looking to escape, what you're doing is bringing the customer a problem. This is something many people really don't think about at DC Editorial. You're bringing the customer problems, and when you bring a customer a problem, the customer has no incentive to buy your product, because here you are telling me that there's another crisis in DC Comics when I'm looking to get away from my problems in life. And if I'm looking to get away from my problems and you're bringing me a problem, people have no incentive to buy your comics. This is why manga has become so popular over the last couple of years, because manga remains consistent. Manga gives you the same stories over and over again, and manga and oftentimes finishes the story, so you have a satisfying conclusion to the story and not a whole lot of chaos and upheaval. And that chaos and upheaval, again, this is why people just are tired of DC Comics, because everything is a crisis. And when you bring a customer a crisis, you're going to have a crisis as related to your sales, because people don't want a crisis. They want to see Superman beating up the bad guys and going back home to Lois Lane. They want to see Batman beat the bad guys. They want to see Flash and Green Lantern beating their bad guys and overcoming the odds. And they want to see heroes doing fun stuff in their lives. They want an escape. And the whole thing is that when you have a constant crisis, you have no escape. And again, we've been through this for the last 10 to 20 years almost. And it's time that, as I see it, for DC Comics to stop focusing on crises and time to focus on organic storytelling with milestones like used to be done at Marvel and DC Comics. The main focus was on milestones until about the 90s, when we started to get into the gimmick storytelling and the shock marketing. And if you want to save your comic book business, David Zaslav, you've got to go and get the DC Comics division back focused on just developing organic stories, letting these characters develop, letting these characters grow in their own books, because it's hard to grow and develop a character in a book where there's a constant event disrupting things, or a constant gimmick coming along and trying to shock people. We just need, like we had back in the 70s and the early to mid 80s, we need to go back to that type of story model where we just see these characters having their adventures, and as we're watching them have their adventures, we get to know them as people, and we get to know why these people are people we should care about. And that's the other problem with DC Comics as related to all of these crises, is we don't get to know anyone because we're so busy being shocked by whatever event is going on. We don't get a chance to get to know anyone and form relationships with any of the characters. So that's another problem that these crises have done, that I believe that we need to stop with the crises, is because we need to get to know all of these characters. We need to get to know what makes them special, what makes them unique, and why we should care about these characters. And it's hard to form relationships with someone when there's a whole lot of drama going on, and we need a couple of years to just let people get to know all of these characters. Again, we need to let these characters have their adventures, and we just need to just stop with the events, stop with the gimmicks, stop with these types of stunts, and just let these characters grow organically in stories, and give the writers the space to go out here and write very compelling stories that are action and character oriented. That's what we need at DC Comics, as I see it. You need to focus on developing these characters and showing how they're great, and not go out here and give us another event that is going to be earth-shattering or some universe-changing event, because universe-changing events are not really resonating with the reader, because you've done so many of them that the reader feels overwhelmed. The reader doesn't feel like they can care about these characters, because here you are giving me yet another event where we're seeing everybody in survival mode instead of showing us how these characters live, because we want to get to know the characters. We want to see what's great about them. We want to see what's great about their rogues galleries. We want to see what's great about their arch enemies and their relationships. But the whole thing is, if you have another event where everybody dies, then we don't get to see how they live. And if we don't get to see how they live, then the reader just doesn't care. So that's why I say we need a couple of decades without a crisis. We just need a couple of decades with just some good old-fashioned storytelling. Let some milestones accrue in a character's life as related to getting to know them, and let us get to know what's great about a DC character instead of giving us another major event that nobody really wants to buy and nobody really cares about. So when I look at DC Comics, they really need to get off the crisis train, and they need to get back to the organic storytelling that made DC characters unique and distinct for multiple generations. Now, my new comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is just a couple of days away and will be launching on Kickstarter this Wednesday. So I would really appreciate if you guys would put in a pledge for the first full John Haynes comic book. And if you want to check out my previous comic, Easting No Good Deed, it's available on Kindle for 99 cents. So if you want to pick up those comics, if you want to pick up the Death's Door, it's going to be on Kickstarter Wednesday, and No Good Deed is on Amazon.com right now for 99 cents. And if you want to get caught up on the John Haynes story, you can pick up the books of the John Haynes series, starting with The Temptation of John Haynes on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. And you can also pick up the books of the John Haynes series on Amazon.com as well. And if you want to see me do more comic-related videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.